Byzantine were a completely different set of concerns from the humanist Renaissance concerns.
Yeah.
But he treated it instead as a primitive.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, but it's interesting because in a way we've reached the end, I guess, of this. We've kind of come, even the modern period, like the 20th century period, was already a breakdown of the Renaissance idea and already a breakdown of the ideals of the Renaissance. And so you can see in modern artists an inkling, let's say in someone like Kandinsky, you can see an inkling of trying to recover a different type of artistic language, a more algebraic language, a more typified language. And so I think that right now, most people have the capacity to understand what iconography is about. They're not as blinded as they were, during the Baroque period, where it's like, I don't think they could have even imagined what this was about. Like, what was this stupid art about? But at the same time, it acts as a weird, it's funny because it acts as a mythological backdrop for even the Renaissance. In making the Middle Ages dark and in making them kind of this dark past that we're moving out of, they ended up making it also a mythological backdrop out of which they ended up existing. Just like if you read Greek architecture, Greek myth and everything, they have this sense of this ancient time, this time of the gods, or this time of the Titans, or the time before, out of which we're not that, but we're still, it's kind of like our unconscious past that we're, right, our imaginary past, right? And so you have all the fairy tales, all the folk stories end up looking way more medieval in their structure. The king, right, the castle, the prince, the princess, all of this stuff is, although it did continue into the modern age, it really does have a medieval root. The dragon, the trolls, all the monsters, all of this stuff is definitely more medieval. And it's still there today. I mean, all of fantasy is really just treating the Middle Ages as a dream, as a kind of mythological dream world.
Right. And I'm going to plug something here. First of all, the fact that you mentioned Kandinsky, who was also a synesthete, very interesting.
Oh, really? I didn't know he was a synesthete. Yeah, makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Yes,
because
absolutely.
this whole thing is about.
Yeah. But if there's anybody watching or listening to this now who's a fantasy fan, I call A Cloud of Outrageous Blue fantasy adjacent. Okay, so it is historical fiction. Adjacent. Yeah, it's historical fiction for sure, but it does have this, because it deals with perception and it deals with kind of magical thinking, and it's written in sort of a magical realist style. I think that, people who enjoy fantasy will kind of like find a way into that. Mm-hmm. But so have you read, I think it's Katsuo Ishiguro, am I saying his name right? The man who wrote, is it Remains of the Day? Oh my gosh, anyway,
the answer is going to be no, I didn't.
Well, he wrote a book that you should definitely read called The Buried Giant.
Okay.
And it is written at the moment where, I think it's probably supposed to take place in the year maybe 600.
Okay.
And it's this kind of transitional point from when the Saxons had come in and sort of like assimilated, right? So you have like this conflict between the Saxons and the Britons, mm-hmm. The Britons, Britons.
Yeah.
And as like Britain culture is kind of dying out and Saxon culture is rising, right? But the cool thing about it is at first you think you're reading a book of historical fiction, but then there's a dragon, and these like mythical realities are just kind of taken as commonplace, mm-hmm. and they go to find this buried giant, and so the book really becomes like about the death of the old world and the death of dream time, the mm-hmm. death of that time before, and the emergence of like what then is modern, the modern world, right?
Well, it's the right time to deal with it because yes. In the way that I talk about the Middle Ages is also the way that the Celtic past, what it plays for the Saxon invasion, because in the end, your king is still going to be King Arthur. You know,
Yes.
hundreds and hundreds of years later, your king is still King Arthur. He's still a Celt.
Mm-hmm.
None, no, despite the, or he's still from that world. So there's a sometimes an idea that he's Roman. Like, I don't know about that. That
Right.
he's like that he's a Roman, but in that time, and so none. So despite the fact that you've pushed that aside, you push it into the margins. You know, it still remains there as your kind of